A black belt stepped over the chain and mocked the dead. "This isn't guarding," he said. "It's cosplay for a crowd." Then he kicked the tomb guard in the face. A sickening crack. Blood. The guard didn't even blink. For a full second, he stood still. Then he broke protocol. And when he finally did move, let's just say the black belt stopped talking and stopped standing. Want to know what happened next? Then hit subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's begin. There are certain stories that remain with you forever, etched into your memory like scars that never quite fade. This is one of those tales. It unfolded on a scorching Tuesday afternoon in Arlington, Virginia, when the oppressive heat created dancing mirages above the pristine marble headstones. The kind of sweltering weather that makes clothing cling to skin within moments of stepping outdoors. The type that drives most reasonable people to seek refuge in air-conditioned spaces. Yet Arlington National Cemetery remains open regardless of weather conditions. And the same holds true for the dedicated men who stand sentinel over its most hallowed ground. Marcus Cow was decidedly not among those reasonable people seeking indoor comfort that day. At 26 years old, Marcus had constructed his entire existence around the concept of invincibility. He held the title of three-time national kickboxing champion, maintained an unblemished professional mixed martial arts record of 15-0, and commanded his social media empire where followers treated his every word as divine truth. He possessed the kind of presence that demanded recognition the moment he entered any space. More crucially, he expected that recognition to come with unwavering admiration. Marcus's upbringing in Chicago's affluent suburbs had been shaped by a successful father, who preached that perception was reality. From his 12th birthday onward, Marcus had immersed himself in martial arts training, migrating from one training facility to another, perpetually hunting for the next challenge, the next rank, the next trophy to claim. Professional competition began at 18. His first major sponsorship arrived at 21. By 25, his earnings from social media endorsements had surpassed his actual fighting income. However, success had a corrupting influence on perspective, and Marcus's worldview had become dangerously distorted. He had cultivated a circle of enablers and flatterers who only told him what he wanted to hear. His romantic partner was a model whose interest in his follower count exceeded her concern for his character. His manager was a smooth-talking opportunist who viewed Marcus as a human cash machine. His sparring partners were either too intimidated to challenge him meaningfully, or too financially dependent to risk honest confrontation. On this particular Tuesday, Marcus had navigated his black Lamborghini Huracan, a vehicle worth more than most people's annual salaries, from his luxury downtown DC penthouse to Arlington National Cemetery. The route had taken him past some of the nation's most powerful landmarks, including the Pentagon and the monuments that defined America's capital. Yet Marcus remained oblivious to the significance of his surroundings, his mind laser-focused on the spectacle that would shatter the internet. The concept had been brewing in his thoughts for weeks, sparked by a dare from someone in his comments section challenging him to test those statue guards at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Though buried among thousands of other comments, this particular challenge had hooked Marcus's attention like a barbed wire. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate something that had been gnawing at him for years: that military discipline and pageantry were nothing more than elaborate performance art, that when confronted with genuine combat expertise, their rigid formalities would crumble. Marcus had conducted thorough research. Naturally, he understood that the tomb guards, officially designated as sentinels of the tomb of the unknown soldier, were volunteers from the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Old Guard. He knew they endured intensive training and had to satisfy impossibly demanding standards. However, in Marcus's estimation, all of that amounted to military red tape. How challenging could it be to remain motionless and appear solemn? His preparation had been meticulous. The timing was strategically chosen at Tuesday afternoon, when visitor traffic would be manageable, but not overwhelming. He had fully charged all his equipment, established multiple camera positions, and even brought backup devices in case of technical difficulties. His social media team had been building anticipation for days, dropping cryptic hints about a game-changing challenge and promising content that would revolutionize everything. As Marcus pulled into the cemetery's parking area, he experienced the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded major confrontations. His pulse quickened, his awareness heightened, his muscles tensed with anticipation. He had faced killers in the ring, men who had dedicated their lives to destroying other human beings. What threat could one ceremonial guard possibly pose? The journey from the parking lot to the tomb led him through the cemetery's heart. Endless rows of white markers stretched in all directions, each one perfectly positioned, each representing a life sacrificed in service to the nation. The sight should have been humbling, but Marcus was too fixated on his mission to appreciate the solemnity of his surroundings. He walked past clusters of tourists, families with children, elderly veterans moving slowly with walking aids. Some recognized him. He noticed a few pointing and whispering, but most were absorbed in their own reverent journeys, their personal connections to the sacred earth beneath their feet. The tomb of the unknown soldier emerged gradually from the hillside, rising like an otherworldly monument. The pristine marble structure was both elegant and powerful, its clean geometry and timeless proportions embodying eternal principles that transcended any particular era's political turmoil. But Marcus saw neither artistry nor symbolism. He saw a stage, with himself as the starring performer in the drama about to commence. Marcus positioned his main camera on a compact tripod, carefully adjusting the angle to capture both himself and the solitary guard, maintaining his vigil at the tomb. The guard was Staff Sergeant Micah Rowan, though Marcus remained ignorant of the man's identity or rank. To Marcus, this was simply a target, a figure in dress blues standing motionless with a rifle, resembling a museum display rather than an active soldier. What Marcus couldn't know was that Rowan had been standing guard at the tomb for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. He had requested this assignment after completing his 3rd deployment in Afghanistan, following the loss of 11 platoon members to an IED explosion near Kandahar. The transition from active warfare to ceremonial duty had initially been jarring, but Rowan had grown to understand that this too was combat, a different form of warfare, waged not with ammunition and explosives, but with discipline and devotion. Each morning, Rowan began his day at 4:30 a.m. with a preparation ritual. After showering and shaving, he would spend up to an hour inspecting his uniform. Every fastener, every crease, every thread demanded perfection. His boots were polished to mirror brightness, his rifle cleaned and examined until it gleamed flawlessly. By the time he assumed his position at the tomb, Micah Rowan, the individual, had transformed into something larger, a living embodiment of the nation's gratitude to its fallen defenders. Becoming a tomb guard was not an accidental career path. It demanded a minimum of 2 years of exemplary military service, an unblemished record, and physical standards that would challenge Olympic athletes. Candidates had to meet strict height requirements between 5 feet 10 and 6'4". With proportional weight, they underwent psychological evaluations, physical fitness assessments, and had to demonstrate unshakable composure under extreme pressure. The training process itself was legendary for its intensity. 6 months of daily instruction encompassed everything from military history to the precise mechanics of ceremonial duties. Candidates were required to memorize the names and service records of every individual interred in Arlington National Cemetery, more than 400,000 people. They learned to march with mechanical precision, to execute directional changes accurate to the degree, to remain motionless for hours regardless of weather conditions. As Marcus initiated his live broadcast, fine-tuning his camera and checking audio levels, Rowan continued his methodical 21-step march along the black mat. His movements were exact, mechanical, almost hypnotic. Each step consumed precisely 1.5 seconds. At each end of his route, he would pause for 21 seconds before executing a flawless about-face. The routine honored the unknown soldiers, 21 steps representing the 21-gun salute. 21 seconds for the same symbolic significance. Marcus's stream viewership climbed rapidly: 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. His audience knew his reputation for boundary pushing, for attempting feats others wouldn't dare consider. Comments flooded in immediately. "He's actually going to do it. Those guards are just for show. Don't get yourself arrested. This is going to be incredible." The validation was intoxicating. Marcus thrived on this energy, his confidence expanding with each supportive comment. "What's happening, warriors?" Marcus announced to his camera, his voice echoing across the sacred grounds with casual irreverence. "Today we're going to discover whether these tomb guards are as formidable as they claim to be. I mean, seriously, they just stand there all day. How difficult could it possibly be?" He redirected the camera toward Rowan, zooming in on the guard's expression. "Look at this individual, stone-faced, probably thinking about his meal or his girlfriend or whatever. But we're going to see what happens when he encounters someone who genuinely understands combat." The comments accelerated, creating a waterfall of encouragement and disbelief. Some viewers urged him to reconsider, warning about legal repercussions, but they were overwhelmed by the majority pushing him forward. Marcus flourished on controversy, and this was shaping up to be his most controversial stunt yet. Rowan, meanwhile, was completely aware of the developing situation. His peripheral vision registered the camera equipment, the gathering crowd, the mounting tension, but his training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Throughout the years, he had managed protesters, intoxicated tourists, even occasional, mentally unstable individuals who targeted the tomb for their grievances. The procedure remained constant: maintain dignity, preserve the site's sanctity, and escalate only when absolutely necessary. Through his earpiece, Rowan monitored chatter from the security command center. They were observing the situation, prepared to intervene if required, but they also trusted that Rowan was capable of handling most situations independently. He had received commendations twice for his ability to defuse tense situations, without compromising his composure or the ceremony. Marcus approached the white chain barrier separating visitors from the sacred area. The warning signs were numerous and explicit: silence and respect. Do not cross the barriers. Photography is permitted but flash is prohibited. Yet Marcus had built his reputation on ignoring regulations that constrained ordinary people. He stepped over the chain with deliberate showmanship, ensuring his camera captured every moment of the violation. The reaction from other visitors was immediate and visceral. An elderly woman gasped and covered her mouth in shock. A family with young children quickly retreated from the area. A group of veterans, identifiable by their military-style headwear and bearing, began moving closer with hardened expressions. But Marcus remained oblivious to their disapproval, completely focused on his phone screen and the rushing stream of comments. "Hey there, statue man," Marcus called out, waving his hand before Rowan's face as the guard completed his turn. "Earth to Soldier Boy. Are you in there? Can you hear me? Or are you actually just an automaton?" Rowan's gaze remained fixed ahead, looking through Marcus as if he were transparent. His jaw remained set, his shoulders squared, his breathing steady and controlled. The only indication of his awareness of Marcus's presence was the subtle tightening of his grip on his rifle, a movement so slight that only someone with extensive military experience would have detected it. The live stream chat erupted with laughter and emoji reactions. Marcus was reveling in it, performing for his audience like a seasoned entertainer. He began shadowboxing near the guard, throwing rapid combinations that stopped mere inches from Rowan's face. His movements were fluid and powerful, showcasing the years of training that had made him a champion. "This is almost too simple," Marcus declared to his camera, his voice heavy with manufactured confidence. "I'm literally inches from this guy's face and he's not even blinking. What kind of training is this? In my facility, if you can't respond to a threat, you're going to get hurt." He began circling Rowan, his movements predatory, resembling a large predator stalking its prey. The guard maintained his ritual, undisturbed by the aggressive display. But Marcus was just beginning. He retrieved his phone and started taking selfies with Rowan in the background, making exaggerated expressions and gestures. "Say cheese, statue, man," Marcus laughed, capturing photo after photo. "You're going to be famous. Well, more famous than you already are. I mean, how many people actually recognize who you are? But after today, everyone's going to know both of us." What Marcus failed to comprehend, what he was incapable of understanding, was that Rowan's stillness wasn't weakness. It represented strength of the highest caliber. To remain motionless while being mocked, to maintain composure while being disrespected, to continue performing your duty while chaos erupted around you, this required a level of mental fortitude that few individuals possessed. Rowan had developed this discipline in Afghanistan's mountains, where remaining calm under pressure often meant the difference between survival and death. He had learned it during his first deployment, when his convoy was ambushed and he had to coordinate defensive actions while mortars exploded nearby. He had learned it during his second deployment, spending 6 months at a forward operating base under nearly daily attack. He had learned it during his third deployment, holding his closest friend's hand as the man died from injuries sustained in the IED blast that had also claimed 10 other soldiers. His tomb guard training had built upon that foundation, refining his ability to compartmentalize, to separate emotions from duty, to become a living monument to others' sacrifice. Every insult, every provocation, every attempt to shatter his composure was merely another test of his commitment to the fallen soldiers he represented. Marcus positioned himself directly in Rowan's pathway, forcing the guard to halt mid-stride. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, Marcus grinning like a playground bully, Rowan maintaining his distant stare. The contrast was striking. Youth versus experience, arrogance versus discipline, performance versus purpose. "What's wrong, soldier?" Marcus taunted, his voice escalating. "All that training and you can't even look at me? Can't even speak one word?" He turned to his camera, flexing his impressive muscles. "This is what happens when you confuse ceremony with combat, people. This guy's been playing dress up so long, he's forgotten how to be a real warrior." The words lingered in the air like toxic smoke. In the distance, other visitors had begun noticing the disturbance. Some were recording with their phones, others were shaking their heads in disgust. Several had started approaching the scene, though they remained several hundred yards away. Security guards at the perimeter were speaking urgently into their radios, coordinating their response. But Marcus was beyond caring about consequences. He was riding the wave of viral fame, intoxicated by the attention and approval of his online audience. The viewer count had surpassed 20,000, and comments were arriving so rapidly they blurred into an incomprehensible stream of encouragement and outrage. Marcus stepped backward, creating space for maneuvering. He began bouncing on his toes, warming up as if preparing for a championship bout. The movements were smooth, practiced, powerful. He threw several shadow punches, his fists slicing through the air with audible whooshes. There was no questioning that Marcus Ka was an exceptional athlete. His kicks could shatter wooden boards, his punches could dent metal within the ring. He was a natural disaster. "Final opportunity, statue man," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that distinctive brand of cruelty that emerges from someone who has never faced genuine adversity. "Show me what you've got, or I'm going to demonstrate to everyone watching what a fraud you really are." Rowan's response was silence, not the silence of fear or uncertainty, but the silence of someone who had learned that words were frequently unnecessary. He returned to his position, rifle at his side, eyes forward, as if Marcus were nothing more than a drifting cloud. The tension was approaching a breaking point. Other visitors were now openly staring, some filming with their devices, others calling out for Marcus to stop. A group of veterans was approaching with grim determination etched on their faces. In the distance, security guards were sprinting toward the scene, their radios crackling with urgent communications. But Marcus was beyond rational thought now. He had crossed too many boundaries to retreat, invested too much of his reputation to withdraw. In his mind, he faced two options: dominate this guard and solidify his legend, or be humiliated before thousands of viewers. The choice seemed clear. "You know what?" Marcus said to his camera, his voice acquiring a harsh edge. "I've been patient, I've been respectful, but this guy clearly doesn't understand anything except force. So let's communicate in a language he comprehends." He began stretching, executing a familiar pre-fight routine. Neck rolls, shoulder adjustments, hip rotations. His movements were intentional, designed to intimidate. He had employed this routine hundreds of times before competitions, and it had always proven effective. Opponents would observe his preparation, recognize the seriousness of his intent, and begin questioning themselves. But Rowan was unlike his previous opponents. The guard had witnessed genuine violence, not the sanitized version that occurred in a ring with referees and regulations. He had seen men die, had killed men himself when circumstances demanded it. A few stretches and intimidation tactics meant nothing to someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. "I want everyone watching to remember this moment," Marcus continued, speaking directly to his camera. "This is what happens when artificial military discipline encounters real combat training. This is what happens when ceremony confronts reality." He was psyching himself up now, feeding off his own rhetoric. The viewer count had climbed beyond 30,000, and the comments were a mixture of excitement and horror. Some viewers were pleading with him to stop, warning about legal consequences, but their voices were drowned out by the majority encouraging him to continue. Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself as he had been taught. He visualized the technique he was about to employ, a spinning heel kick that had concluded more than one professional fight. It was a move he had practiced 10,000 times, a technique that combined speed, power, and precision into a single devastating blow. That's when Marcus executed his attack. He pivoted on his heel, his leg sweeping upward in a flawless spinning heel kick, a technique he had perfected through years of dedicated training. The kick was beautiful in its execution, precise, powerful, and delivered with his entire body's force behind it. His leg traced a tight arc, building momentum as it swept toward Rowan's head. In competitive fighting, this was the type of strike that ended matches. It was the kind of technique that had established his championship status. The impact sound was nauseating, a wet crack that reverberated across the marble plaza. Marcus had invested everything into it, all his training, all his strength, all his reputation. The kick connected with Rowan's jaw with devastating force, the kind of blow that should have instantly felled any opponent. Marcus had landed this identical kick on professional fighters, men who had spent their entire lives learning to absorb punishment, and it had rendered them unconscious. But Rowan didn't collapse. He didn't even stagger. The kick had snapped his head sideways, and momentarily, Marcus believed he had succeeded. The guard's body absorbed the impact, his neck muscles straining against the force, his jaw taking the complete brunt of the blow. But then, slowly, deliberately, like machinery returning to its default position, Rowan turned his head back to center. His eyes, for the first time, locked onto Marcus's. They were cold, steel gray, and filled with something that made Marcus's stomach plummet. Not anger. Anger would have been understandable, even welcome. This was something entirely different. This was the expression of someone who had been exercising restraint, who had been showing mercy, who had been trying to avoid precisely this moment. "That's assault on a federal officer," Rowan said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority, "and desecration of sacred ground." Marcus felt his mouth become dry. This wasn't proceeding according to plan. The guard was supposed to be stunned, embarrassed, possibly even knocked unconscious. Instead, he was standing there as if Marcus had merely brushed against him. The live stream chat was exploding, but Marcus couldn't focus on the comments. All he could see were those steel gray eyes, and all he could feel was the growing realization that he had committed a catastrophic error. I was just a," Marcus stammered, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. For the first time in years, he experienced genuine fear, not the manageable apprehension that preceded fights, but the deep, primal terror of prey realizing it had wandered into a predator's domain. "Your turn's finished," Rowan said, setting his rifle aside with movements that were both careful and deliberate. "Mine's just starting." The transformation in Rowan was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was a statue, the next he was a weapon. His body language shifted from ceremonial stillness to combat readiness in a heartbeat. His stance widened, his center of gravity lowered. His hands rose to a position that was simultaneously defensive and offensive. Marcus attempted to backpedal, tried to create distance, but Rowan was already in motion. The guard's initial strike was a straight punch to the solar plexus, delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't flashy or spectacular, just a short, economical movement that carried the force of a piston. The blow landed exactly where Rowan intended, expelling the air from Marcus's lungs in a violent rush. What followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but to Marcus, it felt like hours. Rowan moved with a speed and precision that contradicted his previous stillness. Every strike was calculated, every movement intentional. This wasn't the chaotic, brawling Marcus was accustomed to seeing in street fights, nor was it the choreographed combat of professional mixed martial arts. This was something altogether different. Violence refined to its essence, stripped of ego and spectacle. Marcus doubled over, wheezing, his hands clutching his abdomen. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced in competition. Professional fighters restrained their power, even in heated competition. There were rules, referees, medical personnel on standby, but this was different. This was a man who had been trained to kill, who had killed, and who was now demonstrating the distinction between sport and warfare. Marcus tried to straighten up, attempted to mount some defense, but Rowan was already targeting his next objective, a knee to the ribs, delivered with precisely enough force to fracture bone. The impact sent shockwaves through Marcus's body, and he felt something yield inside his chest. He staggered, his vision blurring, his famous footwork deserting him when he needed it most. An elbow to the back of the neck sent Marcus stumbling forward. The blow was precise, targeted, designed to disrupt his nervous system without causing permanent damage. Rowan was still holding back. Marcus realized dimly, even in his anger, even in his righteous fury, the guard was still exercising restraint. He was using just enough force to end the confrontation, not enough to cause serious injury or death. Marcus threw a wild haymaker, desperation driving his actions. It was a sloppy, desperate attempt to regain control, to land something, anything that might reverse the situation. But Rowan caught the punch effortlessly, his hand closing around Marcus's wrist like a steel trap. For a moment, the two men were locked together, and Marcus could feel the incredible strength in the guard's grip. Then Rowan used Marcus's own momentum against him, a fundamental principle of combat that the guard had mastered long before arriving at Arlington. He pivoted, twisted, and sent Marcus crashing onto the marble platform. The impact was brutal, Marcus's body striking the stone with a sound like a heavy sack being dropped. The camera captured every moment Marcus's confusion, his growing panic, the way he seemed to diminish before Rowan's controlled violence. The live stream viewers were witnessing something none of them had anticipated, their hero being systematically dismantled by a man they had dismissed as mere ceremonial decoration. Please, Marcus gasped, the word emerging as barely a whisper. I didn't mean, I was just. Rowan knelt beside him, his knee pressed against Marcus's chest, his face close enough that Marcus could see the scars crisscrossing his neck, the hardness in his eyes that spoke of experiences in darker places than Marcus could imagine. This close, Marcus could see that Rowan was older than he had initially appeared, perhaps 35 or 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent scanning hostile terrain. Those men resting here, Rowan said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. They died protecting people like you. People who believe freedom means doing whatever you want, wherever you want. They died so you could stand here and mock their sacrifice. Marcus tried to speak, but words failed him. He was looking up at Rowan, but he was also looking beyond him, seeing the endless rows of white headstones stretching to the horizon. Each one represented a life cut short, a family shattered, a future unrealized. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt truly insignificant. I served alongside some of those men, Rowan continued, his voice never rising above a whisper. I held them as they died. I carried their bodies home to their families. I stood at attention while their mothers wept over their coffins. And you believe you can come here and transform their sacrifice into entertainment for your followers? The words struck Marcus harder than any physical blow. He had never considered the people buried here as real individuals with real families, real dreams, real fears. To him, they had simply been props in his performance, background scenery for his stunt. But now, looking up at Rowan's face, he began to grasp the enormity of what he had done. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez, Rowan said, his voice taking on a ritualistic quality, killed by an IED outside Kabul. He was 19 years old, planned to become a teacher after his service. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, killed by sniper fire in Fallujah. She left behind 2 children and a husband, Corporal Marcus Thompson. Yes, that's right. He shared your name, killed by a suicide bomber in Baghdad. He was saving money to buy his mother a house. With each name, Marcus felt smaller, more ashamed. These weren't just statistics or abstract concepts. These were real people who had made real sacrifices, and here he was, a grown man with every advantage in life, treating their memorial like a playground. I could continue, Rowan said. I could tell you about every single person buried in this cemetery, because that's what we do here. We remember, we honor, we stand guard over their memory so that people like you can live free enough to disrespect them. The security guards were running now, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. In the distance, Marcus could hear the wail of sirens. His phone was still recording, the viewer count climbing beyond 50,000. But none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was the look in Rowan's eyes, and the crushing weight of his own foolishness. You want to know what real strength is? Rowan asked, his knee still pressed against Marcus's chest. Real strength is standing here for 8 hours in the rain, knowing that no one will thank you for it. Real strength is maintaining your composure when people like you try to break it. Real strength is carrying the memory of dead friends and using it to honor their sacrifice instead of drowning in grief. Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He hadn't cried in front of another person since childhood, had built his entire identity around being tough, unbreakable, dominant. But lying there on the marble, pinned beneath this man who had witnessed real combat, real loss, real sacrifice, he felt like the fraud he had always been. I'm sorry, Marcus whispered, the words coming out broken and pathetic. I'm so sorry. Rowan studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the apology was genuine or just another performance. Finally, he stood up, straightening his uniform, checking his rifle for damage. Within seconds, he was back in position, back to his vigil, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in his soul. Something fundamental had shifted. Some carefully constructed facade had crumbled. He lay on the marble, staring up at the sky, his body aching, his pride shattered beyond repair. Security guards arrived moments later. Followed by police officers, Marcus was arrested, charged with assault on a federal officer, disorderly conduct, and desecration of a national monument. His phone was confiscated as evidence, the live stream ending abruptly and leaving his followers with nothing but speculation and second-hand accounts. As they escorted him away in handcuffs, Marcus looked back at the tomb one final time. Rowan was there, standing his post, protecting the fallen with the same dedication he had shown for years. The guard's face was already beginning to swell where Marcus's kick had landed, but his posture remained perfect, his commitment unwavering. In the patrol car, Marcus closed his eyes and attempted to process what had occurred. He had come here expecting to humiliate a ceremonial guard, to prove his superiority over military discipline. Instead, he had been shown the difference between strength and violence, between purpose and performance, between a warrior and a showman. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and unforgiving. Marcus's attorney, an expensive downtown lawyer who specialized in celebrity cases, attempted to argue that his client had been conducting a social experiment, that his actions were protected as free speech. But the judge remained unmoved. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. His sponsors abandoned him one by one, releasing carefully crafted statements about not aligning with our values and maintaining the integrity of our brand. His gym membership was revoked. His social media accounts were suspended. His girlfriend left him for a reality TV star with a cleaner image and a larger following. But perhaps the most profound change was in Marcus himself. Sitting in his cell that first night, he found himself thinking not about his ruined reputation or his legal troubles, but about the look in Rowan's eyes. It was the look of someone who had found something worth protecting, something worth sacrificing for. It was the look of someone who understood that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about serving something greater than yourself. The other inmates initially tried to test him, as they did with all new rivals. But Marcus discovered that he had no appetite for violence anymore. The respect he had once commanded through intimidation felt hollow now, meaningless. He began reading first military history, then philosophy, then personal accounts of soldiers who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. When Marcus was finally released, he drove straight back to Arlington. He parked outside the cemetery gates and walked to the visitor center, where he spent hours learning about the history of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He read about the guards who stood watch in all weather, about the soldiers who lay beneath the marble, about the families who still visited decades after their loved ones had fallen. He never attempted to approach the tomb again. Instead, he would sit on a bench several hundred yards away, watching the guards perform their ritual, beginning to understand what he had witnessed that day. It wasn't just ceremony, it was love, it was commitment, it was the kind of strength that came not from muscle and bone, but from the willingness to stand for something bigger than yourself. Rowan never spoke about the incident publicly. He continued his duties, stood his watches, maintained his vigil, but sometimes, when he caught sight of Marcus sitting on that distant bench, he would allow himself the smallest of nods, not in friendship, but in recognition that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that teach, rather than destroy. The story became legend in its own way, passed down through military circles and whispered in gyms across the country. It became a reminder that true warriors aren't made in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the only audience is conscience and the only reward is the knowledge that you've done your duty. And Marcus, he never fought professionally again. He returned to school, studied military history, and eventually found work with the Veterans Charity. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day at the tomb, that strength without purpose is just violence, and that the greatest battles are often fought not with fists, but with the simple act of standing guard over something sacred. Years later, when people asked him about that day, Marcus would simply say that he had learned the difference between being strong and being a warrior. The tomb still stands, the guards still watch, and somewhere in the distance, on a bench overlooking the endless rows of white stones, a man sits in silence, finally understanding what it means to serve something greater than himself.